When I was a kid, Christmas Eve wasn't just magical, it was the pinnacle of my childhood fantasies. I'd lay there in bed, straining my ears for even the faintest jingle of sleigh bells or the shuffle of boots on our roof. My parents orchestrated the illusion masterfully, leaving behind half-eaten cookies and carefully forged notes from Santa himself. Even when I stumbled onto the truth, my love for the holiday didn't fade. Instead, I embraced it as my turn to carry on the charade for my own kids. This year, however, Christmas Eve turned into something far from magical. It twisted into a nightmare that I'll never fully understand, something that left me questioning not just the holiday but the very safety of our home. And the worst part? I was at the center of it all. The evening started innocently enough, a picturesque, Hallmark-card version of the holiday. My son, Jackson, 6 years old and endlessly curious, teamed up with my 4-year-old daughter, Emily, to arrange a plate of cookies and a glass of milk for Santa. My husband, Mark, and I tucked them into bed, their faces glowing with excitement. Jackson made his usual attempts to bargain for extra time to catch Santa in the act, but eventually, the two of them drifted off. By the time the clock chimed 11, Mark and I were in the living room, basking in the warm glow of our Christmas tree as we set out the presents and filled the stockings. It was the kind of night that felt timeless, all laughter, hot cocoa, and the quiet satisfaction of making magic for our kids. At midnight, Mark stretched and let out a yawn, excusing himself to bed. I decided to linger for a while, savoring the peace of the moment and the soft twinkle of the lights. That's when I heard it. The sound came from above, a dull, muffled thud that seemed to resonate through the ceiling. At first, I dismissed it as snow sliding off the roof. But then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and unnervingly slow. The kind of steps that sent a shiver crawling up your spine because they carried weight, intent. I froze, straining to listen, every fiber of my being on high alert. Burglars? No. This was different. The deliberate pace, the calculated direction, it wasn't human. Then I heard the laugh. Ho, ho, ho! The sound was wrong. It wasn't the jolly, booming laugh you hear in holiday stories. It was guttural, almost animalistic, reverberating through the walls like a growl. My chest tightened as my eyes locked onto the fireplace. The fire had long since died out, leaving the hearth cold and shadowed. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped directly above the chimney. Silence followed, a stillness so oppressive it made my ears ring. And then, with a scraping sound that made my teeth ache, something heavy landed inside the fireplace. My mind raced, flipping through every rational explanation and coming up empty. Before I could move, he stepped out. The figure loomed, impossibly tall even as he stooped to exit the fireplace. His frame was broad, his presence suffocating, and every inch of him exuded a malevolence that turned the warm glow of the Christmas tree cold. His coat was the first thing I noticed. What should have been a festive red was instead a dingy, dark crimson, stained with streaks of soot and other unidentifiable substances. The fur trim around the edges was yellowed and clumped, more like the pelt of a wild animal than the fluffy white in storybooks. His boots, cracked and caked with filth, left wet, gritty smears across the rug as he moved. And then there was his face. The beard that hung from his chin was a tangle of knots, speckled with ash and something darker. His skin, pale and sickly, stretched tightly over sharp, angular features. But it was his eyes that rooted me in place, small, black pits that gleamed like polished coal, glinting with an unnatural light. When he smiled, his teeth were crooked, jagged, and yellowed, the grin of a predator rather than a giver of gifts. I couldn't breathe. My throat locked up, and my body refused to obey me. All I could do was watch as he knelt by the Christmas tree, the sack slung over his shoulder landing with a dull, ominous thud beside him. The air felt heavier with each second he lingered. From the sack, he began pulling out objects, gifts, but not the kind I'd wrapped hours earlier. The paper was thick, almost leathery, with dark, intricate patterns that seemed to writhe in the faint light. The ribbons were coarse and frayed, and each tag bore the same elegant script. From Santa. One by one, he arranged them under the tree, his movements deliberate, almost reverent. I wanted to scream, to yell for Mark upstairs, to do anything, but I was frozen in place by the sheer wrongness of it all. This thing, this being, was no more Santa than I was. And yet there he was, fulfilling some dark parody of the legend. As he finished, he stood to his full height, brushing soot from his coat in a series of sharp, practiced motions. For a moment, he stood there, motionless, as if savoring the scene before him. Then his head tilted, and those coal-black eyes locked onto mine. "Merry Christmas," he said, his voice a low, guttural rumble that echoed unnaturally in the silent room. The words jolted me, breaking the paralysis that had gripped me. I staggered backward, nearly toppling the chair behind me. His grin widened, an impossibly sinister expression that made the room feel even darker. Without another word, he turned and moved back toward the fireplace. With a grunt that sounded more like a snarl, he hoisted himself up, his movements swift and disturbingly fluid for someone his size. In seconds he was gone, leaving only the faint smell of ash and decay in his wake. I collapsed into the chair, trembling uncontrollably as I stared at the fireplace. My mind raced, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. It couldn't be real. It shouldn't be real. But the evidence was there, undeniable. The strange gifts under the tree, the filthy boot prints on the rug, the lingering, oppressive chill in the air. I sat there for what felt like hours before Mark's voice startled me. "Hey, you coming to bed?" he asked, his voice groggy but concerned. When he noticed my expression, his brow furrowed. "What's wrong?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I pointed to the gifts beneath the tree. His eyes followed my trembling hand, narrowing as he took in the unfamiliar parcels. "Where did those come from?" he asked, his tone sharp now. Did you pick those up last minute?" I shook my head violently. "No," I whispered. He brought them." Mark's face paled. "Who?" "Santa." For a moment, he just stared at me, searching my face for some hint of a joke. But there was none. Slowly, he approached the tree, his hesitation palpable. He picked up one of the packages, his hands shaking slightly as he turned it over. It was heavier than it looked. The tag read, "To Jackson. From Santa." Mark set it down quickly, his movements jerky. "We should get rid of them," he said, his voice firm but uneasy. Whoever left these, it's not normal." But something stopped us. A deep, instinctual dread settled over both of us, as though touching those gifts again might invite something worse. In silence, we retreated upstairs, locking the bedroom door behind us, leaving the sinister presence where they lay. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was surreal. I had barely slept, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over again, searching for some semblance of logic. But there was none. When I finally stepped into the living room, the sight of the Christmas tree, glowing softly with its garland of lights, felt like a cruel mockery of the terror I had witnessed. Mark was already there, sitting stiffly on the couch, his eyes fixed on the strange gifts beneath the tree. The kids, completely unaware of the horror, bounded down the stairs, their faces lighting up with excitement. "Santa came!" Jackson yelled, his voice echoing through the house. "Yeah," I muttered under my breath, a lump forming in my throat. Santa came. Jackson tore into one of the strange packages immediately, his little hands ripping through the coarse, leathery wrapping paper. I flinched, half expecting something horrific to happen. Instead, he pulled out the exact Lego set he'd been begging for all year. The one I couldn't find in any store, no matter how early I started shopping. "Look, Mom! Look what Santa brought me!" Jackson exclaimed, his face glowing with pure joy. I forced a smile, trying to match his enthusiasm, but my chest felt like it was caving in. Emily was next. Her tiny hands carefully unwrapped a smaller gift. Inside was a porcelain doll dressed in an old-fashioned gown, its face frozen in a placid, glassy-eyed stare. She hugged it tightly, beaming. "She's beautiful," Emily said, cradling the doll like it was the most precious thing in the world. But there was something about the doll that made my skin crawl. Its eyes, a pale, cloudy blue, seemed to follow me no matter where I stood. I could have sworn its expression shifted, just slightly, as Emily held it close. But maybe that was just my imagination running wild after the night before. Mark and I exchanged a look, his jaw tight with unease. "What do we do?" he whispered when the kids weren't listening. "We can't take them away," I whispered back, glancing at Jackson and Emily. "Not yet. They'll notice. They'll ask questions." Mark nodded reluctantly, though the tension in his posture didn't ease. We spent the rest of the day trying to act normal, though every time I caught sight of one of those gifts, my stomach churned. The kids, blissfully ignorant, played happily, their laughter echoing through the house. But for Mark and me, the sense of foreboding was inescapable. That night, after the kids were in bed, I went back to the living room. The wrapping paper and stray ribbons from the morning still littered the floor. As I bent down to start cleaning up, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The soot from the fireplace, the same soot I'd seen him track onto the rug, was still there. But now, it wasn't just smudged across the floor. It was shaped. Two enormous boot prints, far larger than any man's, stood out starkly against the hearth. And beside them, scrawled in ash, was a single word. "Good." I stared at the word, my mind racing. What did it mean? Why was it left there? And most importantly, what would happen next? Mark's footsteps startled me as he entered the room. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. I pointed to the message, unable to speak. He crouched down, his face darkening as he read the word. "What the hell is this supposed to mean?" "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling. "But it's him. It's from him." Mark shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "We can't just sit here and do nothing. We need to figure out what's going on." I nodded, though deep down, I wasn't sure there was anything we could do. Whatever we were dealing with, it wasn't something natural. It wasn't something we could reason with or fight. And as much as I wanted to protect my family, I had no idea how. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, sent my heart racing. And when I finally did drift off, my dreams were filled with coal black eyes and a guttural, mocking laugh. The days that followed were a blur of unease and paranoia. Mark and I tiptoed around the strange gifts, unwilling to touch them but equally unwilling to explain to the kids why they might need to go. Jackson built his Lego set with enthusiasm, oblivious to the fact that it hadn't come from us. Emily carried her doll everywhere, talking to it as though it were a real person. Sometimes I could swear I heard her pause, listening, as if the doll were talking back. Mark became obsessed with figuring out what had happened. Late at night, he'd pore over his laptop, scouring the internet for stories like ours. He found forums, dark corners of the web where people shared encounters with things they couldn't explain. Most of it sounded like nonsense, tall tales and urban legends, but a few stories made my skin crawl. Stories of shadowy figures who left gifts that weren't gifts, who marked houses for reasons no one could understand. I tried to focus on the kids, to keep things normal. But the normalcy was a fragile facade, and it cracked a little more every day. Emily's doll, in particular, unnerved me. Its cloudy blue eyes seemed to gleam in the dim light, and I swore its head was turned at a slightly different angle every time I walked into a room. Once, when I went to tuck Emily in, I found the doll sitting upright on her bed, its face turned toward the door. I could have sworn I had left it on the shelf. "Mommy, Clara doesn't like being alone," Emily said when I asked her about it. "She says it makes her sad." "Clara?" I repeated, my voice tight. "That's her name," Emily said matter-of-factly. "She told me." That night, I moved the doll to the attic after Emily fell asleep. I told myself it was just a toy, that I was being ridiculous. But as I climbed back down the attic ladder, a cold draft swept through the house, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The next morning, Clara was back on Emily's bed. I didn't tell Mark. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding insane. But I could see the strain on his face, the shadows under his eyes. He wasn't sleeping either. And then there were the boot prints. Every morning, new ones appeared by the fireplace. Sometimes there were only 2, sometimes more, as if someone had been pacing. They were always the same size, far too large for any human. We tried scrubbing them away, but they always returned, perfectly outlined in ash. The word "good" remained scrawled beside them, untouched no matter how hard we tried to erase it. One night, after the kids were asleep, Mark and I sat in the living room, staring at the fireplace. The air felt heavy, charged, as if the house itself was holding its breath. "We can't keep living like this," Mark said finally, his voice low but firm. "We have to do something." "Like what?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What can we do, Mark? Call the cops? Tell them Santa's been breaking into our house?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for his laptop, opening a bookmarked page. It was one of the forums he'd been reading, a thread about the Dark Claus. The stories were all eerily similar, a sinister figure leaving gifts, marking houses, and, in some cases, returning for something else. "They say it's a test," Mark said, scrolling through the posts. "The gifts, the word, it's all about judgment. If you're good, you're safe. But if you're not..." His voice trailed off, but he didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication was clear. That night, I dreamed of him again. The dark, hulking figure emerging from the fireplace, his coal-black eyes gleaming with malice. In the dream, he leaned close to me, his jagged teeth bared in a twisted grin. "Are you good?" he whispered, his voice a guttural rasp that shook me to my core. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat, the echoes of his voice still ringing in my ears. Beside me, Mark stirred but didn't wake. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding. I didn't know the answer to his question. And that terrified me. The final incident happened 3 nights later. I woke to a faint sound, a soft scraping noise coming from the living room. My blood ran cold as I realized it was coming from the fireplace. Slowly, I nudged Mark awake, motioning for him to stay quiet. Together, we crept down the stairs, each step agonizingly loud in the silent house. The living room was dark, save for the faint glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. At first, I thought it was empty. But then I saw him. He was crouched by the tree, his massive frame casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. His sack lay open beside him, empty now. Slowly, he turned his head, his coal-black eyes locking onto mine. His grin widened, those jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light. You've been good, he rumbled, his voice low and mocking. For now. And then he was gone, vanishing up the chimney in an instant. The room fell silent, the air still heavy with his presence. Mark and I stood there, frozen, for what felt like hours. When we finally moved, it was to gather the kids and leave the house. We packed only what we could carry and drove through the night, putting as much distance as we could between us and that place. We never went back. The house was sold, the memories left behind. But every Christmas, without fail, a single package arrives at our new home. It's always wrapped in that same coarse paper, the tag bearing the same elegant script. From Santa. We never open them. We never touch them. But we can't bring ourselves to throw them away. Because no matter where we go, he knows. And he's watching. Always.